Hello everyone. Here today we'll be taking you on an aquarium tour through time using the game Megaquarium. This however is this aquarium is stocked entirely with creatures from the Ediacaran period and the Paleozoic era. So it's a time span of 635 to 252 million years ago, uh, ending 20 million years before the first dinosaurs. Now there are over 150 species of animals in this aquarium, most of them being the work of the mod teams Project Artificialis and Jagofang Designs, and several more. I have a full list of mods in the description so you can try this out yourself if you'd like. Now I made this both for my own enjoyment and as something of an educational tool, since this is probably one of the cooler ways to get a feel for the aquatic animals that once lived on our planet. Because there's so many animals in this aquarium, I'll not be able to go into detail and list out every genus and species, but I will do my best to explain what the animals you're looking at are, what they're related to in the present day, any particularly noteworthy animals, and a bit about major extinction events and evolutionary trends that occurred during the Paleozoic era. I've tried to recreate the environments these animals lived in as best I can with the tools in the game, so no obvious flowering plants or brown algae that had not yet evolved. Also, just going forward, any time in this video when you see yellow sand at the bottom of the tank, that's salt water, and the brown gravel means fresh water. I've also made separate aquariums for both the Mesozoic and Cenozoic eras, but those will have to be their own videos. So starting here at the Ediacaran, 635 million years ago, this tank includes some of the earliest recognizable animals called Vendobiota. While these look like plants, we can tell based on the presence of cholesterol in the fossils that these were animals. And most were just feeding on single-celled organisms in the water. Their family relationships are still unclear, as they don't share any clear, obvious link in the modern animals. And their body parts are very soft, so they don't tend to fossilize well in general. But yeah, this is what many of the first animals would have been like. Over here we have some slightly more mobile Ediacaran animals, so not very mobile by today's standards, but the green one here is hypothesized to be an ancestor to arthropods, and the blue could only be narrowed down to a bilaterian, so bilaterians are animals, that have bilateral symmetry and have, a head end and a back end. But yeah, so all bilaterians can trace their ancestry to something like this, so symmetrical and vaguely worm-shaped. Beyond that, we can't be more specific. So ends the Ediacaran. We move into
the Cambrian explosion.
This is when almost all modern animal phyla evolved. At this time, animals have become much more mobile and active than in the Ediacaran. The evolution of new animals with new sensory equipment like eyes and jaws seems to have been part of what kickstarted the Cambrian explosion, as these animals competed and preyed on each other more severely than before, creating more complex food webs than had existed up to this point, and driving the evolution of new defensive strategies like faster swimming and hard body parts, which allowed these animals to fossilize more easily and be discovered by us 500 million years later. Now in this first tank we have primitive relatives of today's cephalopods, Nectocaris, which look kind of like squid with, just two tentacles. And we have this trilobite, Elenoids. So trilobites are arthropods that first appeared in the Cambrian, and would last the entire Paleozoic, but would go extinct at the end of the Permian. They have no particularly close relatives in modern day besides just the rest of arthropods. So that's things that we would typically call like bugs, so like insects, crustaceans, and arachnids, etc. Now here we have the giant Dinocarid and Anomalcaris, and these Dinocarids are relatives of modern arthropods, but further out than even the trilobites were. Now this Anomalcaris was possibly the Earth's first giant apex predator, nearly as large as a human being at 1.5 meters long, which is absolutely colossal for this time period. And it has both eyes and jaws and these little mouth parts that, yeah, first developed in these Cambrian animals and would have helped it prey on smaller animals like trilobites. And we have fossils of trilobites that seem to match up with the mouth parts of Anomalocaris. So, some of the Earth's first big active swimming predators. Really cool to see. Now, in here we have these things called penis worms. You can see them squiggling about there, named for obvious reasons. We still have these in the present, and they are partially responsible for some of the first fossil burrows in the Cambrian, preyed on other animals that they could catch. And then we also find some fossils of them inside the shells of other animals, meaning that these were the first animals to live sort of the hermit crab lifestyle, which is really neat. And we have yet more trilobites and some early mollusks in there. Now in here we have another relative of Anomalocaris. He's swimming in the water column. These little tiny guys called Opabinia. And they have what almost looks like a trunk kind of thing, with like little pincers at the front they would use to grab prey items. And then also on the bottom here we have Wiwaxia. So this is sort of like is an early mollusk, so you can imagine it as kind of like a slug, but with sort of Stegosaurus-like plates going down its back. It's really neat. And then here we have our last Dinocarid. This is Herdia. And down here on the bottom we have these hyoliths, which no one's quite sure if these are brachiopods or mollusks. Um, Both of those being things that are alive today, but it's unclear if this animal has any particularly close relatives left. Now moving over here, so down in the bottom we see the little spiky thing that is Hallucinogenia. This is a relative of modern day velvet worms, named Hallucinogenia for looking like something that you hallucinated. Now the rest in here we have some more mollusks on the bottom, and floating in the water column we have some relatives of arrowworms and then some chordates. Of particular note is this one here, Picaya, right in the middle. You can see floating with the little tentacles at the front. Now this thing is thought to have been one of the first chordates. Some people have doubted that. Now chordates are the group that we are in. It includes all vertebrates and things that are not quite vertebrates but very close that have notochords. We have a more definitive chordate in here. These are Hycuichthys. Now they are absolutely tiny, about the size of a fingernail. Now, when it was first discovered, it was thought to be, the first fish. Doesn't seem to be the case. Seems to be a little further out than that. But regardless, these guys are definitely related to vertebrate. These are chordates that are related to vertebrates, and so, this tiny animal here, if not our direct ancestor, is pretty close to the ancestor of vertebrates. So think every single fish, amphibian, reptile, mammal, all can trace their lineage back to this tiny little Cambrian chordate, Hycuichthys. Something like this, at least. This is just a little touch tank I added with some of the same animals because I thought it'd be cute. Now, it's not clear right now if there was an extinction event at the end of the Cambrian, so we found some Cambrian fauna that have lasted well beyond the proposed extinction time, so it might have just been a gap in our fossil record that made us think there was a major extinction. But now we can move on to the next period, the Ordovician. So here we have, going here, we have some of the first true fish here in this aquarium. So we have the armored Astraphus, which is kind of like a tadpole with armor on it, and the higher in the water column, these eel-like Cynodonts. So these are both vertebrates. Astraphus represents something sort of like what our ancestors would have been at this time, and these Cynodonts are other vertebrates that are named for their teeth that are cone-shaped. The teeth themselves are very common in the fossil record in the Paleozoic, but the body fossils are much rarer. So, um, and this species, this genus here, actually in this tank, got Panderotus. Some paleontologists think that it may have actually been venomous based on the shape of its teeth. So if that's true, then this would represent the first venomous animal known, or the oldest venomous animal known to science. Now moving into the big boys, we have these orthocones. So these are all cephalopods related to the modern nautilus. The largest one, it belongs to the genus Endoceras. Um, yeah. So many fossil nautiloids were shaped like this, but none, survived to the present. This general cone shape. Um, and the giant orthocones like these would have been some of the largest animals the Earth had ever seen up to this point, with some reaching perhaps 6 meters in length, and with some authors suggesting that they may be 9 meters long, but not too many people still agree with that, but still much larger than any animal had been up to this point. So very impressive creatures. And then over here we have, these little graptolites. So these are type of hemichordate. This forms first evolved in the Cambrian, but it's only in the Ordovician that we started to see major quantities of zooplankton like these that would float high in the water. And later on, filter feeding animals would, get to take advantage of that much more. Now over here we have this trilobite tank, a whole bunch of trilobites here. Trilobites had diversified into many different forms by the Ordovician. We have the largest here, Isotellus rex, 72 centimeters long. This is the largest trilobite ever, and then we also have the smaller, free-swimming pelagic trilobite here, and just several more smaller ones. Also amongst them are these crinoids. So crinoids are still around today. But they were much more diverse in the Paleozoic. We can see even more crinoids in here, sharing this tank with these eurypterids, often called sea scorpions. Now, now they're not true scorpions, but they are chelicerates, so they're in the same group that contains scorpions, as well as spiders and horseshoe crabs. The group Chelicerata is named for the chelicerae, the mouth parts that characterize this group. In spiders, these have evolved into, venom-injecting fangs, and in true scorpions, they look kind of like a pair of tiny pincers on either side of the mouth. Eurypterids are carnivorous, with a pair of paddle-like appendages that aid in swimming, as you can kind of see here. Not so well in this model, but yeah. And the larger eurypterid in this tank, Pentacopterus, is the oldest known eurypterid from the fossil record. So, at the boundary between the Ordovician and the Silurian, we have this giant fungus, Prototaxides. I don't think it's entirely clear if this was a fungus or a lichen, meaning either a fungus on its own, or if it was a fungus and a lichen, a fungus and an algae or moss living symbiotically. But it was unquestionably the largest terrestrial organism of its time. Could get much taller than the ones you're seeing right now, at up to 8 meters in height. At this point, also, green algae had started to move onto land, and these would eventually give rise to land plants. These early plants would these early terrestrial plants would start to break down terrestrial rocks to access phosphorus, and this nutrient influx may have caused a boom in marine algae, which drastically cooled the planet. At the same time, portions of the supercontinent Gondwana drifted over the South Pole, causing ice caps to form, lowering global temperatures further and drastically dropping sea levels worldwide. Now, most marine organisms then and now live in very shallow coastal waters, where is hard rocky bottom for reef-building organisms to establish. So drastic changes in sea levels would impact a wide variety of organisms. There's also some speculation about mass anoxia at the time, which meaning low oxygen conditions. Um, and altogether, these Ordovician, Silurian, and extinction events added up to the second worst mass extinction in the Earth's history, with 85% of all species going extinct, surpassed only by the Permo-Triassic extinction. However, this extinction event did not seem to lead to many drastic changes to the ocean's food webs, as many extinct species were replaced by close relatives. Biodiversity would gradually recover in the Silurian, which we are here at now. So here in this first tank, we have the tiny little nautiloid Sphuceras with its sort of rounded sausage-shaped shell. Here we have in this tank the nautiloid Pseudoceras again, as well as some other animals, trilobites and fish, crinoids that we will see in other tanks here. Now here we have yet more Eurypterids, which have really diversified by this time. This first species here is Eurypterus remipedes, so the animal that forms the group as a whole takes its name. This was a very successful Eurypterid, with this genus accounting for like 90% of all Eurypterid fossils known. And yeah, as a group, they exploded in diversity during the Silurian, with some becoming the largest known arthropods of all time, like one of them being this here, Pterygotus grandidentatus. This is an enormous Eurypterid, almost as big as they come. Now this genus had a worldwide distribution, it was very successful. It and its other relatives seem to have had very good vision, matching that of modern predatory arthropods. And as big as that species of Pterygotus was, its relative here got even bigger, Jacalopterus renaniae, possibly the largest arthropod of all time, at over 2.5 meters long. Now, this animal seemed to live in mostly fresh and brackish water. There was actually a new paper this week that came out analyzing this and several other large Eurypterids like Pterygotus, and concluded that Jacalopterus in particular, was very well suited to catching and tearing into the bodies of armored fishes and smaller arthropods. So this would have been a top predator in its ecosystem. Let's see. In this tank down on the bottom, we have some more trilobites, a smaller species of Eurypterus, and the crustacean Anictozon, as well as the filter-feeding fish, Thelodus, which is, basically the whale shark of its day, despite being much, much smaller. And then here at our last Silurian tank, we have several more floating crinoids, some jawless fishes, and a very early jawed fish, an acanthodian. Most of these will make it into the early Devonian, so I'll discuss them in more detail in the next tank. But this is when the first fishes with jaws appeared, and those will be very important in the Devonian. So here we have a very important plant at the end of Silurian, Cooksonia. Now this is an early vascular plant. Basically, all plants that you know of, or you can think of, are vascular plants, meaning they're full of veins and tubes that transport water and nutrients around the plant, and allow vascular plants to get so much larger than things like mosses. Cooksonia represents basically the prototype of plants that would come to dominate all terrestrial ecosystems during what we call the Silurian Devonian Terrestrial Revolution. Plants in the Devonian would inherit this vascular tissue and evolve into much more impressive forms. Now we've entered the Devonian, and we have just a very large selection of early Devonian jawed and jawless fish. Now, fish with jaws are a very important group in the present, as we humans are in this group, as are almost all fish we have left except for the lamprey and the hagfish. So, uh, yeah. Jaws allow, jaws, it turns out, evolved from the bones that make up gill arches, and as it turns out, they're really useful. So, jaws allow fish to process foods that aren't already bite-sized. So it's no wonder that jawed fish end up being the dominant fish in the present day. Jawed fish can adapt their jaws to any sort of life cycle, either predation, herbivory, filter feeding. All these things are possible, um, where they weren't quite so easy before. Now, the first jawed fish we have here, you see in the middle, sort of right in the center of the screen here, is acanthodes, which is related to basically part of the group that would eventually give rise to all cartilaginous fish. So that's sharks, rays, and ratfishes. And that's what their earlier ancestors would have looked like. And then, let's see. There's also a lot more floating crinoids in here. Now, marine animals in the present day will congregate around anything that provides cover, and the same was definitely true in the past. So these crinoids would have provided isolated floating habitats like we find in the present around floating mounds of seaweed or even plastic pollution. Up to this point, most marine animals were concentrated in reef or benthic environments, but Silurian and Ordovician saw an increase in the diversity of plankton, which are drifting animals. And this would in turn lead to the gradual diversification of nectons, swimming animals that would feed on plankton in open water. And it's in the Devonian where we see more, increasingly more pelagic animals, so fishes, animals that live in open water, and the most common of these pelagic animals then and now are fishes. And then moving into here, we have some of our first placoderms, or armored fish. So these are really what characterize the Devonian fauna. We have two species of Bothria lepus. So these are heavily armored bottom feeders. So this genus was apparently very successful, as there are more than 60 species known. They could inhabit freshwater, and we will see that again in later tanks. And we also have them sharing this tank here with a smaller species of Pterygotus. So it's a pretty actively swimming Eurypterid. Sorry. And then here we have some more placoderms. So these are two species of Cacosteus, so the type of arthrodeer placoderms. Now this whole family is known for their toothless, sort of shearing jaws made out of bony plates that they have connected to their jawbones that kind of work like a pair of scissors. They're very neat, and we'll see several more of these in the Devonian section here. So here we have another Eurypterid, and down in the bottom some trilobites, and then floating in the water column, swimming, we have a very early coelacanth. So coelacanths are lobed-finned fishes related to tetrapods, four-legged land vertebrates, and so these fish here are more closely related to you by a lot than they are to things like goldfish, tuna, or sharks. Now, slightly closer to us, we have our than coelacanths are lungfishes, represented here by the very early lungfish Dipterus. Lungfish still exist today and are the closest relatives of true tetrapods, but not tetrapods themselves. And we have some more, trilobites down here on the bottom. And then getting into here, we have a very different type of fish. So these are acanthodians. So they are also related to the cartilaginous fish. and they're sharing this tank with two species of ammonites. So ammonites are cephalopods that, even though they have shells, they're much more closely related to the shellless squids and octopuses than they are to the shelled nautilus that exists today. So these guys evolved in the Devonian and were a major component of all the world's oceans for 340 million years, and only went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, at the same time as the non-avian dinosaurs 66 million years ago. So ammonites are some of the most common fossils in the world, and medieval peoples came up with all sorts of interesting explanations for them, like that they were coiled snakes that were magically transformed into stone. You can kind of see how they might have gotten that idea there. You see the sort of coiled shell. But they would end up carving the snake heads themselves into the rock to sort of make it so. And then getting to here, we have our first really big pelagic fish. So, yeah, I have the bottom-feeding placoderm Jaguarnia on there, living a similar lifestyle to modern-day stingrays. But up in the water column, we have two sort of early cartilaginous fish. So now you may have heard that sharks have been around for 400 million years, and this sort of depends on how you define the word shark. So there were shark-shaped cartilaginous fish like these that were, sort of distantly related to sharks, potentially some of them closer related to things like modern-day ratfishes. But as they're not really in the line of descent with sharks, it's a bit of a stretch, I think, to call them sharks. The basic shark shape is something that would evolve numerous times in this lineage of fish, as well as several others, like animals that would return to the sea, like Ichthyosaurus, which we'll see in the Mesozoic. So, yeah, really neat stuff. This larger one here, Stethocanthus, is often called the ironing board shark. Once again, not a true shark. And then moving over here, we have some very, very large placoderms, predatory placoderms. So the blue-green one is Eastmanosteus, and the smaller one is Bungardius. So these would have been more open water predators of relatively large armored prey that would use their sort of scissoring jaws to kind of cut through. Now we are leaving the saltwater behind and moving into Devonian freshwater ecosystems. So first we have just a couple of jawless fish. And then we have here a mix of some eurypterids, placoderms, and feeding down the bottom. And then over here we have a mix of three different acanthodians. So these are basically include the ancestors of sharks as well as just, relatives of those ancestors. So you can see how it's hard to see from here, but these guys would slowly, eventually adopt the more shark-like shape and give rise to our modern sharks, rays, and ratfishes. Over here we have another smaller species of acanthodian. This is actually also in the genus Acanthodes. And then, yeah, another one here as well. Now this is actually, I believe, an early ray-finned fish, so named because of the way their fins look sort of like a hand fan. Now in the present, these are by far the most diverse group of fish, with 30,000 living species. So that's more than half of all the vertebrates on the planet. But in the Devonian, they're really just, well, they were, just little fish in a big pond at this time. So they would come to dominance much later. And then over here we can get to the really juicy stuff, as we have our first true tetrapodomorphs. So these are lobe-finned fish with lungs and strong forelimbs. and this is the lineage that would give rise to true tetrapods. So now this animal in here in this tank is still very much shaped like a swimming fish, with a more laterally compressed body for cutting through the water, but we can see the transition to a more tetrapod body shape with Panderichthys. You can see, let's see if we can get one over here, the very flattened body and the strong four flippers that would have allowed this fish to get around decently well on land, but were probably first used to get about in shallow water. So the transition from water to land was not straightforward, as it turns out. Legs are still very useful for moving around underwater, and especially in the shallows. And so is breathing air, as it turns out. So if you live in shallow freshwater, these kinds of environments can be very poor in oxygen. And so by being able to extract oxygen from the air, you can get all the oxygen you need to survive in, say, if your pond dries out, or to just have an advantage over the other fish in your pond that can't breathe air. So you'll be able to move faster and sustain movement better than them and prey upon them, as well as be able to move potentially between ponds. So, yeah. We know that it works this way because there are actually a lot of modern day fish that get all their oxygen from the air, up to 90% in some fish like gar, arapaima, and of course lungfishes. And all of those do not go about on land. They just draw the advantage purely from being able to breathe air as a free swimming animal. So almost like a fish equivalent of a dolphin in that sort of sense. It's a strategy that just kind of works. And we now actually think that the swim bladders of modern ray fin fish were first evolved as lungs. And we can tell that based on analyzing the evolutionary relationships of modern day bony fishes, and we find that the earliest branching ones don't have a swim bladder, they have a fully functional lung. So that seems to have been the ancestral condition. So now sharing the tank with our Panderichthys, our tetrapodomorphs, are some coelacanths there. You can see sort of spotted guys there. So these are another lobe-finned fish, but fishes that only swim. Now coelacanths almost went extinct at the end of the time of dinosaurs, 66 million years ago. They're thought to be extinct for a long time until one was captured, found at a fishing market in off the coast of, I believe, South Africa, and then showing that at least one genus, Latimeria, still survives in the present. We had no fossils from the intermediate period because, as it turns out, the remaining coelacanths had evolved into deep ocean animals that lived on mid-ocean ridges and underwater mountain ranges, so not areas that would lead to fossils that we would be able to discover. And so that's how they went undetected in the fossil record all the way up to the present. Also sharing this tank are the same Boreothepus placoderms that we saw before, bottom feeders, you can see over there. And then much stranger are these giant Eurypterids, Hybratopterus, arthropods, which would actually survive into the Carboniferous. We actually have fossil trackways attributed to this animal that show could get around on land, although it probably fed on aquatic detritus. In the game, this animal can also get around on land, it's just not, oh, here's one doing it now. So that's sort of how it would have looked. It's really neat. Absolutely giant. And Panderichthys coming back out. And then so moving into our final Devonian tank, we have the apex predator of the Devonian seas, Dunkleosteus. Previously thought to be just an absolute giant. It's over 7 meters long. Newer research puts the maximum length of these fish at closer to 3.5 to 4 meters. A little smaller than the ones in this tank, but still very large fish, especially for this time period. Like the other Arthur deers, it had those slicing bony plates in place of teeth. It probably opened its jaws very quickly to sort of suck in prey that it would either swallow whole or chomp in half with extreme force. So yeah, Dunkleosteus is probably the most impressive carnivore in this aquarium. Um, Very much an icon of the Devonian seas. And sharing the water with it are several animals we saw in earlier tanks. Try to recreate a sort of Devonian sort of crinoid and sponge-based reef as best I could here. Yeah, but as impressive as Dunkleosteus was, it went extinct in the Devonian mass extinction, which killed roughly 80% of known Devonian species. So this seems to have been several extinction events that happened in rapid succession, and the main theory as to why has to do with these, basically trees. So not closely related to any modern trees, but these were the first land plants to evolve these sort of wood fibers, and they evolved at the end of the Devonian, and with these new fibers they were able to get much, much larger than any earlier plants, at several tens of meters in height. And it seems like these newly evolved forest habitats had a major impact on all of the world's ecosystems. So, by just absorbing CO2 for growing, they drastically reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, which leading to a global cooling effect. So it's the opposite of what we're doing, pumping CO2 into the atmosphere right now. And these trees would have also, through their root systems, would have broken down rocks, increased the rate at which rocks were weathered, and increasing the flow of certain nutrients into the oceans like phosphorus and iron, which would have led to phytoplankton blooms, which would have died and taken and deposited on the bottom of the ocean, taking even more CO2 from the air, and also creating ocean dead zones where there's not enough oxygen for most animals to survive. So out of all of the Earth's mass extinctions, this is not the worst, but one of the worst, and it seems to have been the most devastating to the world's fish out of any mass extinction event. Basically, all of the placoderms die out at this point. These trees would continue to dominate the land, and because no fungus had yet evolved that could break down the wood fibers, the trees would die and stack on top of each other in swamps all over the world, creating what would eventually become most of the world's coal. Now, it's because of this stored carbon that the next era was called the Carboniferous. And the Carboniferous would belong to some interesting new kinds of fish. So these are more cartilaginous fish, elasmobranchs. So these are early relatives of sharks, rays, and ratfishes, although none of the sort of true members of those groups had yet evolved. You have the same Stethocanthus from earlier. It was a very long-lived genus, as well as several others. One, yeah, sort of more distant relatives of modern cartilaginous fish, but you can see the general shark shape in several of them. Very interesting animals. Now on the right we have some more elasmobranchs, including some that evolved this very eel-like shape. But these are not eels, they are, once again, cartilaginous fish, so these are almost like shark eels. And then down over here we have another cartilaginous fish that evolved a very ray-like shape, but this is only convergent with true rays. It's not a direct ancestor. As well as some ancient sea star down here and carboniferous sponges. In this tank, we have some even more elasmobranchs. The colorful one is basically the shark equivalent of a parrotfish biting off bits of sea sponges and hard static animals. And then we have some. The one with the horn is related to modern day ratfishes, um, as is the very small eel-like one in this tank here. Um, Now the green black striped one fish is actually a coelacanth, so lobefin fish. And then moving on over here. So we have some very early rayfin fishes and acanthodians in this tank. Uh, let's see. Yeah. I'm sorry, this is the tank that contains most of our early rayfin fishes. Um, and one lamprey, so that's the only group of jawless fish to survive into the present. And over here we have a very early mantis shrimp. And we have one more cartilaginous fish in here. It's the smaller species of Stethecanthus. Um, the one that's called an ironing board shark, but it's not really a shark. So now we're moving into the freshwater section of the Carboniferous. Here we have probably the strangest animal in this whole aquarium. So this tank contains a number of animals from the Mason Creek, which is a best known a fossil site that's best known for this really bizarre animal called the Tully monster. So it has a mouth on the end of a long sort of stalk or trunk, and it also has eyes that into stalks. Now, the Mason Creek has very good fossil preservation of soft body parts, and so we have hundreds of fossils of these things. But it's it's weird. It's really weird, and its appearance is so bizarre that we don't actually know definitively what's related to. Some paleontologists think it's a fish. Some others think it's something else entirely, some kind of invertebrate. We really just don't know. Which is just kind of fun. Now its tank mates here are pretty mundane by comparison. We have just two early rayfin fishes as well as a small freshwater eurypterid. Now all marine eurypterids were wiped out in the end Devonian, so the group as a whole survived into the Carboniferous and the Permian only in freshwater habitats. Although a few would actually leave the water entirely in the Carboniferous and invade the land separately from all the other arthropods. Just many groups of arthropods did that in the Carboniferous. Here we have two much more recognizable lungfishes. So you can see, like modern lungfishes, the lobed fins are very much reduced and the body is just kind of elongated, with mostly just main fin around and large sort of tail fin. These lungfish, both these genera of lungfishes managed to survive another 100 million years, dying out in the Triassic, so we will see them again in future tanks. Now in here we have, early shark relative Trionodus, and then more interestingly, we have an early tetrapodomorph of some sort called Crassigyrinus scoticus. Now, there's actually some disagreement over whether or not this thing is a true tetrapod, or a stem tetrapod, but regardless, it has definitely evolved to reduce its amphibious capabilities, having pretty much entirely lost the front limbs and severely reduced the hind limbs. So it was probably not really amphibious in any way. And continuing the trend of limb loss in tetrapodomorphs, we have two true tetrapods that actually have no more pods or feet. So these so soon after our lineage evolved to digits, these asteropods evolved to lose basically all of them and kind of live like aquatic snakes. So they were the first tetrapods to give up on legs, but they were far from the last. These are kind of the first sort of very organisms to evolve the sort of tetrapods to evolve the sort of snake lifestyle. Although one of these here still has a couple of its legs. Um, and they're sharing their water with another freshwater eurypterid. Um, Now, this tetrapod here is also fully aquatic, but still retains all of its limbs. This is Spondylarpeton, which would also not make it into the Permian. And it's unclear if this group of tetrapods called Embolomeres were closer to um, modern amphibians or if they were closer to amniotes. So that's the fully land tetrapods. Um, Although these certainly would have still laid eggs in the water like amphibians. Yeah, it's unclear what their true family relationship is. So now here we have some much more recognizable amphibians. These are amphibi amphi amphibimus. So this is possibly a very early member of the lineage that would include all modern amphibians. So the last common ancestor of frogs, salamanders, and caecilians would have looked something like this. Kind of like a short-tailed salamander, I guess. Um, and moving on, we have this very early horseshoe crab. It's still very similar to modern horseshoe crabs. So these are chelicerates, so they're related to the eurypterids as well as spiders and scorpions today. Um, Now here we have the last representative in this aquarium of the giant eurypterids. So this is Hippodopterus, which we saw earlier in the Devonian. This thing lasted into the middle Carboniferous. Um, some other eurypterids lasted until the end Permian, but this is the last one in the aquarium. Here we have a cousin of dragonflies. So these are called griffinflies. That grew much larger, that could grow much larger than modern dragonflies. So this was partly a result of the increased levels of oxygen in the atmosphere, which is really useful for um, insects with a very sort of simple respiratory system that's basically just tubes that let air, kind of oxygen diffuse from air directly into their tissues. But there were other periods in the Earth's history where oxygen levels rose to similar levels as the Carboniferous, and we did not see giant insects evolve again. And it seems like the actual main factor preventing that was the evolution of flying vertebrates. So during the Carboniferous, the only things that could fly were insects, but in the Triassic period, pterosaurs first evolved, and then in the Jurassic we would get the first flying birds would evolve, and then in the Cenozoic we would get bats, and so um, all the rest after the Carboniferous and after the Permian, giant insects would be preyed upon by flying vertebrates, which would really seem to suppress the sizes of insects for the rest of time. So it's unlikely we'll ever see anything like this again. Oops. So now we have arrived at our very last Carboniferous tank. This is also our first Permian tank, as we have two temnospondyl amphibians here. Yeah. Let's see. We have Lonisodectus and the sail-backed Platyhystrix. So, the Carboniferous did not really end with a mass extinction, but there was a smaller extinction event from the collapse of the early rainforests, which seems to have been caused by climate change from either glaciers or volcanoes that led to the Earth becoming much drier. And it would lead to the extinction of many sort of early land and freshwater animals from the Carboniferous. Now these amphibians would survive. So we have, yeah. Let's see. So there's the question for Platyhystrix, why the sail? No one really knows for sure, The earliest hypotheses were that it evolved for thermoregulation, um, but there's not really much evidence for there being a lot of blood vessels that would have made that possible. There are also multiple other animals in its environment that had these sorts of sails, which we'll see these later. Um, so it might just be that these sails evolved as some sort of signal, and possibly even defensive mimicry, with Platyhystrix sort of pretending to be something more dangerous than itself. And then you have the Isodectus here, which is a much more fully aquatic amphibian, almost fully aquatic with very reduced limbs, but still would have been capable of moving about on land. We'll see it again also in a later tank. And then we have one more Permian griffinfly here. So this is Meganeuropsis. And this is so far, the largest insect to have ever flown, as far as we've discovered up to this point. About the size of almost like a small hawk or a falcon. Now moving into here, we have one of the bigger predators of the early Permian, the tenospondal amphibian called Ariops. You can see most of them there basking on the land, and a couple in the water here. So, yeah, one of the greatest predators of its age. So temnospondals on the whole represent a very diverse group of amphibians that may or may not contain our modern amphibians. They evolved in the Carboniferous. So many of the early ones include some very massive predatory forms that mostly go extinct in the Mesozoic. So Ariops here could get up to 3 meters, which is a little larger than the ones in this tank. It would have weighed a few hundred kilograms. So it's probably eating basically any large vertebrates it could find, and maybe also coming onto land and eating arthropods. And probably swallowed most of its prey whole. So while it was definitely aquatic to some extent, it had a very short tail and could probably not swim very well. And seems to have been much better adapted to walking, both on land and underwater. And may have been eating in both places. So interestingly, also these early amphibians do not undergo metamorphosis like modern amphibians. They would instead kind of gradually grow into their adult forms. These Ariops are sharing their tank with the late surviving member of the Acanthodian lineage of Stemmelasmobranchs, which would all go extinct in the middle Permian. So, this is a large amphibian. We're now getting into the Permian amniotes. So, amniotes are named for the membrane layers, layered membranes of their waterproof eggs. And this group can be split into 2 branches. They're both present today. So, sauropsids, which includes all reptiles, including birds, and synapsids, which is mammals and our extinct relatives. Now, all amniotes are descended from these waterproof egg-laying tetrapods that first appeared in the late Carboniferous, and this is actually why the platypus lays eggs. So, all mammals used to lay eggs because all synapsids used to lay eggs because all amniotes ancestrally laid eggs. So, yeah, it's not so much that the platypus is a weirdo as it's just kind of the conservative member of the family in regards to specifically reproduction. So all of the amniotes you'll see in this aquarium are synapsids. Synapsids tended to dominate much of the large animal niches in the Permian period, but most of these would go extinct at the end of Permian. A few would hang on. Eventually give rise to modern mammals, but after the Permian, reptiles, sauropsids would end up being much more successful. So in this tank we have, these are Cassiosaurids. So these are some of the first herbivorous amniotes with their tiny heads and short necks. The big one is Catalorhynchus. See, they're kind of swimming on top of each other right now. And the smaller one is Cassia. You can see they're very related by their very similar shapes. So at this time in the Permian, most amniotes still lived in the same types of habitats where they first evolved to leave the water, which would be um, lowland swampy forests, very similar to the modern day Everglades. Um, the primary producers there would have been aquatic vegetation, and that's what cassisaurids would have fed on, sort of like a modern day water buffalo. And it would be millions of years before amniotes would really take over ecosystems far away from large amounts of fresh water later on in the Permian. So right now they're sharing this tank with some lungfish and also shark, ancient sort of cartilaginous fish relatives we've seen earlier, Triotis. So now cassisaurids were the large herbivores of this time who were their main predators. And here's one of them, Dimetrodon grandis. So this is one of the biggest land predators of the early Permian, so it's outsized only by other members of its genus and a couple of closely related genera. Um, I'm betting all of you have seen a picture or a toy of Dimetrodon at some point, as it was discovered very early on in the history of paleontology, um, and has had a lot of time to accumulate fame. So it's very commonly mistaken for a dinosaur, and you'll find it in lots of, like collections of little plastic dinosaur toys. But it is a synapsid, so it's related to us and other mammals, and not reptiles. Um, and it went extinct 40 million years before the first dinosaurs would evolve. So, in evolutionary terms, a Dimetrodon toy belongs more with a set of human action figures than it does with toy dinosaurs, which is just kind of fun to think about. So the name Dimetrodon means two measures of teeth, in reference to the fact that it has two different types of teeth in its mouth. Um, so let's see. It has, one or two pairs of canine-like teeth near the front of the jaws, and uh, have more incisor-like cutting teeth in front and behind the canines. So synapsids like these would eventually iterate on differentiated teeth, and so these two types of teeth would eventually become our many types of teeth. Humans have four, so incisors, canines, premolars, and molars. And now Dimetrodon would have uh, preyed on both terrestrial and shallow water vertebrates. So we have found fossils of land animals with tooth marks, and we've also found fossils of amphibians and little burrows that have cut marks on the bones attributed to Dimetrodon. The hypothesis for how those animals were handled is that the Dimetrodon actually dug them up while they were estivating. So estivation is the dry season equivalent of hibernation, when amphibians and lungfishes and things like that that need water just kind of tuck themselves away and sort of go dormant until the rains come back. And it seems like Dimetrodon was digging around for those and eating them during the dry season, which is really fun to have. There were so many species of Dimetrodon throughout the early Permian, so we have actually one more over here. Um, Much smaller species, Dimetrodon lumsey, and it's sharing the tank with another, some small rayfin fish and another temnospondyl isodectus. Um, in the game, these guys only will not live with any other members of their own species, so I have put one here and one over there, just so you have a better chance of seeing them. But in life, a Dimetrodon of this size would probably eat an amphibian this size without hesitation. Um, And then over here we have another relative of Dimetrodon. So this is Cynodontosaurus. So it's very similar. It has the sail, um, but it also has, sort of compared to Dimetrodon, much longer, sort of thinner jaws that may have helped it both be better at eating fish than Dimetrodon, and also potentially at reaching into burrows to get at amphibians and lungfishes, things like that. So there is the question, why the sail um, in this group of synapsids. Um, so there were actually other synapsids, some herbivores, Edaphosaurids, that also had sails living at the same time, and then there was the Platyhystrix that we saw earlier, sharing this environment and it had sails. Um, so Yeah, there's no other time in Earth history we have this many terrestrial or amphibious animals with these big sails living in the same place and same time. So there's no obvious answer as to why. It doesn't seem like temperature control um, is a good explanation for it, as the anatomy doesn't really back that up. Um, and so it's most likely was used to signal to members of their own species. Um, but then the presence of so many sail-backed animals suggests or hints that maybe um, they were all sort of mimicking each other, which is a form of Malarian mimicry, where multiple organisms will evolve to mimic each other. Um, but yeah, it remains a mystery for now. And then moving on, we have some even more lungfish. So we saw these species earlier. They had survived the Carboniferous into the Permian, and I believe at least one of these species, the genera, would actually survive in the Triassic as well. Here we have um, another rayfin fish, uh, and then seeing the Dimetrodon again. Sorry, it's gonna take me a second to walk over to some of our last guys. So here we have another at the end here. Whoops, getting past this. At the far tank there, we have these marine rayfin fish. Um, Bobastrania, Strinia, Bobastrania. There we go. And these would survive the end Permian mass extinction. And in this tank we have the tetrapod Trimeracus, with the external gills of a true water breather, sort of like a modern day axolotl. And you can also see its very reduced fins. So gills and very short legs point to this being a fully aquatic animal. And we have even, showing the tank, we have even more Triotis, which would also survive into the Triassic. And then we have in here another larger relative of Triotis. This is Orthocanthus, so this is also not a true shark, as you can kind of tell by its very weird fin configuration and very long body. So this animal would go extinct in the Permian, and sharing the tank with it are actually two genera of true sharks, although not closely related to any modern species of sharks. So we have right here Hybodus, and then over there on that side, the more one with the jaws in the bottom of the mouth, Acrodus. So these are all hybodont sharks. There's many yet unnamed species that are tenuously assigned to these genera, sort of a waste basket taxa, but there are many species that are related to these or potentially descended from them that shared this shape, body shapes for an incredibly long time. We know these hybodonts from several very fully preserved skeletons, which is really rare to get for fossil sharks, since the skeletons are not calcified and tend to decay before fossilization. So hybodont sharks can be identified by very large spines in front of the dorsal fins. You can see here, 1, 2, same for this Hybodus. And then also small horns in their faces for this Hybodus, and many other hybodonts. And some uniquely shaped teeth, which can't really show you here compared to other sharks. So these two genera would actually be extremely successful, or at least, if not these genera, then these families. They would last all the way through the Permian mass extinction, through the entire Mesozoic, before finally going extinct at the end Cretaceous. Although they seem to have gone extinct in the marine realm during an earlier portion of the Mesozoic, and sort of lingered on till the end Cretaceous in freshwater, as freshwater sharks. And yeah, they're found at this time in both marine and freshwater habitats. And over here we have some of the same aestropods, so legless tetrapods that we saw in the Carboniferous, and they lasted through the middle Permian. And then we have Uh, one more fully aquatic tetrapod, Acaria. So this is one of the last embolomeres. So they're true tetrapods, but not very close to either temnospondyls or amniotes. Um, and then getting into here, this is probably our most impressive Permian predator, maybe the most impressive animal in this aquarium. This is the colossal temnospondyle amphibian Prionosuchus. So it estimated up to 9 meters long, based on scaling of smaller relatives and looking at also modern day gharials, estimated at 9 meters long. So this is potentially the largest amphibian or the largest non-amniote tetrapod ever discovered. The narrow jaws suggest that it was primarily a fish eater, like modern slender-snouted crocodiles. And the relatively tiny limbs mean that it could not have supported itself on land. Um, so it is. I'm not sure if it is known or well supported whether or not it was still an air breather, or if it would have had external gills like modern day fully aquatic salamanders. But based on its overall size, I would be inclined to think that it still had to breathe air to get oxygen. Yeah. So, Prionosuchus would not make it into the Triassic, but other large predatory temnospondyls would. However, during the Triassic, they would have to start competing with relatives of modern crocodilians, and more distant relatives of those that would re-enter the water and start to compete with large temnospondyls for these predatory niches. Um, and large temnospondyls would gradually go extinct by the early Cretaceous period. Although there's some people that think that modern amphibians, Lissamphibia, are evolved from temnospondyls. So if that's the case, then temnospondyls have not gone extinct and they're widely diverse in the present, but with just none larger than the Chinese and Japanese giant salamanders that can reach about 2 meters long. Its tail's just kind of clipping through the tank. Ignore that. And then our last tank contains the cartilaginous fish Helicoprion, meaning spiral saw, after its tooth whorl, where teeth are arranged kind of like a spiral. It's often called the buzzsaw shark, even though it's not a true shark. It's probably closer to chimeras than true sharks. It probably fed on soft-bodied prey, like shellless cephalopods or unarmored fish, pulling the smaller animal into its jaws and then rapidly opening and closing the jaws to cut up the prey animal. Some paleontologists think it might have eaten some hard-bodied shelled animals and kind of using those jaws to pull them out of their shells, but I can't really comment on further on that. Now, in life, the larger species of Helicoprion could grow to over 6 meters long, somewhat larger than a modern great white shark. But unfortunately, the mod I'm using is bugged, and these do not get any larger than 1.5 meters, so about the size of a blacktip reef shark or a human. Helicoprion would have been one of the top predators of the mid-Permian seas, though it would not survive to the end of the Permian. Now, the Permian period would come to a close 252 million years ago with the worst mass extinction of all time, called the Great Dying, which killed off over 96% of all marine species and 70% of terrestrial ones. This extinction event was caused by a massive outpouring of magma from the Siberian traps over hundreds of thousands of years. So imagine a land area about the size of Australia. Now imagine that was all magma, just a massive scar on the surface of the planet. Not a great time to be on Earth. It was enough to cause severe global warming, estimated at an increase of 10 degrees Celsius. Also extreme ocean acidification and widespread anoxic conditions. The acidification was so bad that it led to an enormous amount of extinction in specifically animals with hard body parts, so animals with shells and various types of corals that just did not make it through the Permian extinction at all. None of the large predatory synapsids would make it through either, and and this would also mark the end of the trilobites that have been on the Earth since the Cambrian. And with the end of the Permian, we also come to an end of the Paleozoic era and our journey through this aquarium. So, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this journey through time. We will explore what the survivors of the Great Dying would evolve into in my next video on the Mesozoic era, the Age of Reptiles.